Hey everybody, Marcus here. So I've noticed that there's a lot of videos on YouTube that try to introduce someone new, a beginner, into the subject of philosophy. And I've watched a few of them and I've found them, well, substantially lacking. I find that, well, the people, they mean well, but they don't have any real formal training, and honestly, just the advice is really poor. Now, I've been with the subject for about 20 years now. I studied it formally. So I think I can help you find a foothold from which you can branch out into the vast, vast amount of things that actually exist within philosophical discourse. And the best way to do that, I suppose, is to not so much give an overview of philosophy, but kind of a meta view of what it's kind of all about. So, philosophy in the academy is often described as the long debate. So, it's a conversation that's been going on in the Western tradition for about 2,500 years. Um, Plato, and Socrates being Plato's teacher. So Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. And the works of Plato is usually considered, well, it is considered the first work of true Western philosophy. There are pre-Socratics as well, Herodotus, for example, that fall under the tradition, but really the works of Plato and specifically the Socratic dialogues within Plato are the ones that are considered the beginning. And like any debate, if you try to jump into it somewhere in the middle or the end, you're not really going to know what's going on. So if you try to learn philosophy by starting with a more contemporary philosopher, and Nietzsche is quite popular for some reason, but Nietzsche is quite popular, you're going to be starting your journey around the end of the 19th century, which means that's like 2,300 years into this conversation. And you're going to have a really hard time understanding what Nietzsche says. Well, one, because Nietzsche is fairly complicated, but secondly, because there's going to be a lot of jargon. There's going to be a lot of back referencing. Nietzsche's going to be talking about the things that Kant said, the things that Aristotle said, that Plato said. He's going to be referencing Greek mythology, for example. He talks a lot about the pre-Socratics as well. And you're not really going to get a whole lot out of it without some of the background work. And I think that's the big challenge in starting with somebody like Nietzsche or anybody contemporary for that matter, is that the further down the conversation, the closer to today's date that you pick a philosopher from, the more jargon you're going to get. And it's not just jargon in terms of referencing prior philosophers, but the jargon that came into being within philosophical discourse itself. It accrued over the course of 2,500 years. Terms like, you know, foundationalism, coherentism, consequentialism. These are words, these isms. These are words that didn't exist back in the Greek days. They're short forms, much like communism, democracy. I mean, these are short forms to describe complex concepts. So you're going to have that jargon to contend with as well. So you're best off starting off the debate where the debate started, meaning with the Platonic dialogues. And there's another more important reason that you should start with the Platonic dialogues, and that is that Plato was so massively influential on Western thought that it is joked within philosophical spaces, the Academy being a good example of it, that pretty much everything from Plato from 400 BC leading up to Nietzsche is just a footnote to Plato. As in, every philosopher that followed Plato is ultimately a Platonist and just kind of putting their own spin on what Plato had established. We can say that the Platonic dialogues is the invention of thinking in the Western world. Now, Western philosophy is radically different from Eastern philosophy. I don't deal with Eastern philosophy. It has, well, it's complicated to explain what the major differences of it is, but I'll put it to you this way. The Eastern tradition is fundamentally focused around the ear, the Western tradition around the eye. That doesn't mean anything to you, I know, but trust me when I say that's a massive, massive difference. Another way of putting it is that as far as Eastern philosophy is concerned, Europeans and Westerners are deaf. As far as Westerners are concerned, the Easterners and Eastern philosophy is blind. So if you're somebody of the English-speaking world, an American, a European, somebody that grew up using a phonetic alphabet, you're going to relate to Western philosophy infinitely more, like infinitely more. So yeah, the Platonic dialogues. What else can we say about it? The long debate, start with the Platonic dialogues. Now, there's 36 dialogues in Plato. Most of them are agreed were written by Plato, and a handful of them, there's somewhat disagreement within the academic space about whether or not Plato authored them or not, and there's a few that are generally acknowledged weren't written by Plato, but are included usually as part of the compendium of the 36 because they're so good and so close to Plato's writing that they might as well have been written by Plato. Now, the challenge we're first going to meet attempting to read the Platonic dialogues is the issue of translation. This is a subject that literally no, beginner intro to philosophy video on YouTube talks about, is the subject of translations. Plato obviously wrote in Greek, ancient Greek, even specifically. We don't know ancient Greek. Academic philosophers that study Plato, Aristotle, and the Greeks intensely learn ancient Greek so they don't have to deal with the translations, but we do. And so we need to pick one because there's a lot of them. A lot of people have translated these dialogues. And I have with me the one that you're going to be reading is Plato, the Complete Works, edited by John M. Cooper. This is literally all 36 dialogues grouped together in one big fat book. Now, the order that you're going to read these dialogues in is, let's keep it simple. You're going to read them in the order that they appear in the book. They're grouped. The introduction will tell you of the Cooper translation of how they're grouped, but it doesn't really matter. If you're new into philosophy, it really makes no difference how they're grouped. There's a breakdown of the early works of Plato being more aporetic dialogues, the Socratic dialogues, aporia being a state of doubt. So the early dialogues where Socrates makes an appearance in most of them try to induce a state of confusion. Well, not confusion so much, but a state of doubt in the interlocutor. So we call them dialogues. Why do we call them dialogues? Because, well, each of the 36 dialogues is literally a conversation between two or more people. So, for example, the dialogue entitled Euthyphro, which is 30 pages, is a conversation between Socrates and a young 18-year-old man named Euthyphro. And all the aporetic dialogues tend to have Socrates as the main interlocutor. He engages in a question and answer exercise with the interlocutor after whom the dialogue is typically named. And it usually starts the same way, where there's a subject of general interest. In this case, in the case of Euthyphro, Euthyphro's heading off to the courthouse to accuse his father of murder. A big accusation back in those days because of the perceived impiety about it. You don't bring charges against your own father. I mean, that's crazy. But Socrates, hearing this, well, he looks at Euthyphro and says, well, I've been accused of impiety. What you're doing seems to be impious, but you must think it isn't, and you must therefore believe you have knowledge of piety, so maybe, Euthyphro, you can teach it to me. And Socrates doesn't know anything. So they go into, an exchange of questions and answer, and comes out at the end of the dialogue that Euthyphro comes to learn he doesn't know what piety is, and he ends up not going to the courthouse and running off home. Because ultimately what emerges as part of the dialogue is that Socrates demonstrates to Euthyphro, not by changing his opinion, but by showing Euthyphro that what he believes is false. He doesn't try to give Euthyphro a definition of piety. He just demonstrates to Euthyphro what he defines as piety can't possibly be true. And that effect invokes the state of aporia in Euthyphro, meaning the state of doubt in his own belief. And all the aporetic dialogues function the same way. They end in aporia. A lot of the earlier dialogues are like this. So what we find in Plato is that Plato's not preaching to us. He's not telling us what to think. He just talks about a subject. And why these conversations are so good is that The interlocutors that Socrates tends to engage with believe things that people believe today on the street. So these conversations are like real, and you're going to find reading them that you're finding your own opinions nested inside the interlocutors who are speaking to Socrates. So you're going to be reading, and then one of the speakers is going to give an opinion on knowledge or justice or statesmanship or some subject that they're talking about, and he's going to say to Socrates what you believe. You're just going to be reading it. It's like, oh, this ought to be good. We'll see what Socrates has to say. But also, this is going to be bad because it's not Socrates speaking. So odds are good that this opinion is false. So 36 dialogues. They vary in length. The shortest one, entitled Ion, is about 5 pages. The longest one, entitled The Laws, is over 300 pages. They average out about 30 to 50 pages. I'd recommend that if you're going to read them, try to get one down in one sitting if you can. I mean, it's not usually possible, but get them down in big blocks, because the dialogues have a way, and I have an analogy for this. They're complicated. They're layered, they're complicated, but they're also very simple. So you shouldn't feel intimidated, because you're going to understand the dialogues just fine. You're just not going to understand the depth of what they mean upon one reading, 2 readings, 10 readings without help. But you will get a lot out of them, even on your first attempt, because the way that they're written, so Plato has a way of kind of being like a moving car, and you like hold on to the back of the car while it's driving, which makes you run faster. I guess that's the easiest way of describing it. It's like you gain extra magical mental powers when Socrates is hand holding you through the discourses. You feel smarter reading them because there's a change that's happening. There's a change that's happening. So yeah, I very much recommend that you try to get them down in 1 or 2 sittings, because as soon as you put them down, you go away for a few days, you pick it up, you have no idea what's going on. I mean, it just disappears. So that's one thing about those dialogues. Other things to note beyond the translation issue, and why the Cooper translations, is because, well, Plato was a poet before he was a philosopher. There's a story saying that when Plato met Socrates, Plato was about 18 years old, and he had a play that he just wrote. And he wanted Socrates to read his play and, tell him what he thinks. So Socrates reads this play and says, Euthyphro, you know what? Play is garbage, a complete garbage. So yeah, Plato was a little bit upset about getting that sort of opinion out of Socrates, and he abandoned his vocation as a playwright and started to be a follower and student of Socrates. And Socrates' death came not too long after Plato began to study with him, and he carried on the Socratic tradition in terms of the dialectic. And it took Plato about 50 years to write these 36 dialogues. Philosophy is a slow-moving phenomenon. And there's no jargon in the dialogues. The subject matter is always very interesting. They talk about shoemakers and horse breeders and, shipbuilders and doctors and, politicians. Things you understand, things you care about. All the dialogues, you're going to care about all of them. And because Plato was a poet, they're beautifully written. I mean, they're just pleasant to read. They flow like poetry because they are poetry. Just not poetry. They're prose. How many of them should you read? Honestly, all of them. Read them in the order that they appear. It takes 6 months to read all 36 if you kind of move at a decent pace. It's 1,800 pages. The print is small. It takes about that long. And it's usually understood that you read Plato for the first time twice, because each of the dialogues focuses on a subject with a limited set of interlocutors. So, say Euthyphro's around about the subject of piety. The Republic, which is the crowning jewel of the dialogues, is about justice. The Theaetetus is about knowledge. Statesman about statesmanship. Ion about art. Symposium about love. Phaedrus about love. So there's a lot of them. They each have a subject. Well, the point is that when you read each of the dialogues the very first time you encounter them, you're going to start to see a kind of a pattern slowly emerge as you read more and more of them. And ultimately, all the dialogues kind of relate to each other in method and also in the metaphysical view that Plato is building up. So when you read the first dialogue the first time, you don't have the privilege of the insights of, say, the second, third, and last dialogue because you haven't read them yet. So when you finish all of them and you go back to the beginning, you're reading them again for the first time because now you're reading Euthyphro, which is the first dialogue, with all the experience and insights you have gathered, reading all 36. And it transforms the meaning quite dramatically. So 2 iterations through this is something that is kind of at a minimum what you need to do to get, I guess, at like about 30%, 40% of the meaning behind it. Because like I said, there's layers and there's depth. And some of the dialogues are going to be really, really hard to understand because they can get really abstract. However, they're still worth reading because even though you might not necessarily know everything that's going on, that's not really the point. You're going to get a lot of value from all the side roads and deviations as the arguments are constructed. I find that there's a lot of value in, things that are almost like throwaway arguments within the dialogues themselves. They're just that good. In fact, the Platonic works, these 36 dialogues, are considered next to the Bible the most important achievement that the human species has ever achieved, within writing at least. So this is a significant work. It's not out of date. I mean, there's no concept that philosophy ages in that same way that you would say technology ages. Like, it's not like reading the dialogues is learning how to handwrite until, we move on to typing on a keyboard. It doesn't work like that. You can build an entire academic philosophical career today based on studying this book alone. I mean, there are Plato scholars all over the world actively doing research. This is a live and living subject. And once you start reading the dialogues, you'll understand why, because they're absolutely fantastic. So like I'm saying, Plato is really easy to read because there's no jargon. There's none of this accreted jargon over the isms that have accreted over the years. There's no real back referencing because it's the beginning of the long debate. Now, inside Plato, there is referencing, but usually to the Greek pantheon of gods, the myths that they would have known, and a lot to Homer, specifically to Homer. So what you're going to find in your journey is that you might want to supplement your reading of Plato with reading the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and reading other people's exegetical texts in relationship to the Homeric epics, because the epics are kind of hard to understand in of themselves as well. Get involved in the Greek world of that time. The way to understand this work is ultimately to understand the entirety of the context that that work was produced in and the references that it makes, allusions to. Those are quite useful. Plus, they're interesting. Now, people have a variety of motivations on why they want to get into philosophy. And honestly, I know one of them, quite common one, is a vain motivation. People want to sound, intelligent. They want to be able to quote from something that sounds academic, impress their friends at parties. Well, in the first book of the Republic, when Thrasymachus spoke about power, we can glean blah, blah, that sort of stuff. Look, there's a lot of people that like that. They want to have that capacity. And you will cultivate this reading the dialogue. But as soon as you get to the point where you can do that readily, you're not going to care anymore. You're just really not going to care. The question becomes, can you read other philosophers? I mean, you can read anybody that you want. What I'm saying is that if you pick up Nietzsche today, you're gonna struggle because you have all the back referencing to make of it. And you will understand something. You will interpret, say, Nietzsche, if you were to pick it up immediately, you will understand something. It's not like you won't understand anything. It's just odds are good your interpretation is going to be completely wrong. It's kind of like a waste of time to some degree to start with a contemporary thinker. It's a little bit of a waste of time. And with Nietzsche specifically, I mean, Nietzsche has 13 published works. I mean, I've read them all, and I've read a lot of exegetical texts that live around Nietzsche. An exegetical text, by the way, is a text that, another philosopher would have written analyzing a primary text of another philosopher. So basically analysis of text, or books that are referred to as exegetical. One exegetical text I do have here that I would very much recommend that you can read early on as well is this, Philosophy as a Way of Life. And this book is fantastic because it defends the thesis that the way philosophy was practiced back in the Greek days it had nothing to do with being smart, like with the academic notion of ivory tower, you're an intellectual. It's nothing like this. It was a way of life. Like we can say a Christian lives the Christian way of life. And that kind of means something to you. You expect a Christian to go to church, if they're Catholic to go to confession, to celebrate Christmas, Easter, and things like that, to be involved in certain rituals. That's how philosophy was. That's how it used to be. It was a way of life. It was things you did. You engaged in spiritual exercises with the objective of transforming yourself into a virtuous man and ultimately to lead the good life. Now, what the good life means is argued a little bit between the Greek philosophers, but you'll find that out. Regardless, it's either a life of knowledge, a life of pleasure, a life of action, or just tranquility, depending on which of the schools, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Aristotelians, or the Platonists. So it's a transformative thing. It's kind of like reading philosophy is a little bit like going to the gym. I mean, there's no skill in terms of the gym that has value outside the gym. And what I mean by this is that at the gym, you go to elevate, say, 20 kilos of steel 3 feet off the ground, to then put it back on the ground, to elevate it again off the ground 8 times in sets of 3. That's not a real skill per se. I mean, we don't go to the gym to learn how to elevate steel, 8 times in sets of 3. That's silly. We go to the gym and perform that action in order to alter our body, to get a certain result. And that's what reading philosophy does to you. It changes you. It has to. That's its function. So the way philosophy was taught back in the Greek days, as argued by Hadot, but I believe it to be the case regardless, because there's clues of it everywhere within the ancient writings, is to perform this transformation on the philosopher himself. And philosophy, philosophia, is a compound word of 2 Greek words. Philo being a word that means either friendship or love of, and Sophia, roughly translated to wisdom, but it's a specific type of wisdom. It's a very primal sort of wisdom, differing from something like techne, which is a knowledge of how to say make shoes, how to craft things in general, building a house. It's techne. Episteme, another category of knowledge Aristotle would talk about, is something like mathematics. And then phronesis would be moral knowledge. So, knowing the difference between right or wrong, if there is a good, and what does that mean? And applied ethics, is abortion wrong or right, things like that. Sophia, as a 4th category, is very specific. It's very, very primal. One example that I can kind of give that would fall under Sophaic knowledge would be, say, from Descartes, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Though Descartes never actually wrote, I think, therefore I am, anywhere, but people quote it this way, so I'm going to use it. The way I'm not going to repeat the whole argument of how he gets to that conclusion, but I will tell you what it means. It means something, it means this. It means that if there's thought occurring, if I'm thinking, that means there's an I that must exist in order for that thought to occur. So I think, therefore I am, because there's a thinker that must exist to have the thought going on. That would be synthetic knowledge. It's very self-justifying in a sense, where the justification for it is built into the expression even. So it's kind of like that, very, very basic. And basic, I don't mean like simple. I mean basic as in foundational. It's a very foundational belief upon which you can build more. And what Descartes did from this foundational belief his through logic prove the existence of the exterior world, then the existence of God, or God first in the external world, and then from there pretty much everything that followed suit. But we're not going to talk about Descartes. Ignore Descartes. Stick to the Greeks. Stick to the Greeks. So yes, the Platonic dialogues, the point of philosophy being transformative, yes, it will give you the ability to speak in a more eloquent manner. You don't really need a dictionary reading Plato, though. You would very much sit in a dictionary reading somebody like Nietzsche. God forbid you approach Heidegger. Don't try Heidegger. Don't try Heidegger. It's a lot of pain. It's a lot of pain. The existential thinkers in general are very interesting, and I think a lot of people gravitate towards them, but they're contemporary, and you, like I said, you'll suffer through all these problems, and odds are good your interpretations will simply be wrong. You'll do more harm than good for yourself. And like I was saying with Nietzsche along this line of thinking is 13 works by Nietzsche. One of them is entitled Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, as Pontius Pilate spoke when Jesus was presented to him for judgment. And Ecce Homo is an autobiographical work by Nietzsche. It's very short, but it exists. And most people have not read it because most people that read Nietzsche would have read something like Beyond Good and Evil and perhaps Thus Spake Zarathustra, maybe on the genealogy of morals. But odds are good it's either Beyond Good and Evil or Zarathustra, one or the other. But in Ecce Homo, what Nietzsche writes is that, well, he hates lazy thinkers. He really, really hates lazy thinkers. He was speaking, well, mostly about the academics of his time, the late 1800s, but in general, lazy thinkers. And he says in Ecce Homo that he intentionally laid traps in his writing so that the lazy reader would fall into it and believe a bunch of nonsense that Nietzsche hoped would destroy the lazy thinker. So if you read somebody like Nietzsche lazily, meaning like one of his works, and then don't, put any meaningful amounts of effort into reading commentary and supportive text to understand it, odds are good you're going to end up falling into one of these traps and then, just end up believing nonsense. And the worst thing about it is that you see a lot of this on YouTube. There's a lot of people quoting out of Nietzsche, and you could just tell they have no idea what the hell they're talking about. I mean, they have no idea what they're talking about. Nietzsche would be proud of that. And he would actually be very happy that these people did not engage with his whole body of work, that they believe nonsense. Let them believe that nonsense, let it destroy them. So, yeah, it's easy to misinterpret text even when they're not laden with traps, like Nietzsche did. So yeah, I say start with the Greeks. There's a large body of knowledge out there supporting documents that you can engage with to help with your understanding of the subject. One thing I could recommend potentially is lectures from the Teaching Company. They have really good lectures about, like, say, the Republic, but also Plato in general, that gives a lot of that depth. Yeah, you can look into that. But there's plenty of free stuff also on the internet interpreting those dialogues, helping give more insight about what's actually going on. So yeah, so that's kind of my roundup on how to get started with philosophy. I mean, start with Plato. Everybody else references Plato ultimately, and Plato set the foundation for thinking, the categories. I mean, you want to read Aristotle. Aristotle was a Platonist, so you still need to know Plato. In fact, most of the time, understanding Aristotle is understanding the difference between Aristotle and Plato, specifically on the high order metaphysics stuff, like difference between forms and universals, which may mean nothing to you, but it's like the biggest difference between Plato and Aristotle is forms and universals. So yeah, you're going to end up getting back to Plato no matter who you start with if you're actually serious about the subject. And don't feel threatened by it. Like I said, the dialogues are beautifully written. They're poetry. You will get a lot out of them without any hand-holding because they're simply written. They're about subjects of interest. And and once you get through the first batch of it, I mean, read them in your own tempo, obviously. Dive into some other Greek stuff. I don't think it's realistic to ask somebody to just steamroll through all these dialogues because there's like a lot of text there. So give yourself a few years to, cycle through this stuff and take little journeys out into, say, other philosophers if you're curious about what Kierkegaard has to say or Kant. But you will find that, they're referencing Plato. And, you're going to read something by Kant and he's talking about Aristotle, and then you say you go reference Aristotle to see what exactly all that business is about that Kant's talking about in Aristotle, and you find Aristotle is referencing something from Plato, and it's just that the chain just goes on. And then Plato's talking about the gods, so so that's what it is. That's the big challenge of getting into philosophy, is finding your foothold. Plato's the foothold. It always has been and always will be. It's the beginning of the debate. And give yourself, like I said, a few years to digest this stuff, and then you'll have a solid foundation from which to go outwards and explore other subjects. Now, I could talk about philosophy endlessly, but this is really just to help you know where to start, and this is where you start. The Cooper translation of the Platonic dialogues. So I'll show this book again. Plato, the Complete Works. It's a collection edited by John M. Cooper. The only book you need. All right. So I hope this was useful. Thanks for listening. Go team.